last time we got together, we sort of summarized the point of John 4, taking into account all the plot analysis and all the other information, and then just talked a little bit about more of an exegetical question, or I guess it'd be more even a practical question of part of it exegetical, but looking at that account and asking the question, could you use John 4 as a passage to teach on, how to share the gospel? And we talked a little about that. So you can go back to that video of that if you guys weren't there last time. And then after that, just talking about, again, the prescriptive versus descriptive, and because of the miracle in John 4, Jesus knowing the woman's background without knowing her, some have taken things like that and said that we must perform miracles in order to open the door for the gospel today, especially with unreached people groups. And so we talked a little about that as well last time. And really that had to do, again, with hermeneutics. A lot of these kinds of questions usually come down to hermeneutics, the rules of interpretation. And there, the principle that we want to remember to guide us when it comes to narrative is really connected to authorial intent, right? It comes back to the descriptive versus prescriptive. And in a narrative, does the author intend everything that happened in the story to be a lesson for the reader? Or does the author intend, through the plot of the story, to communicate a particular truth that is the point of the story, and not take every event as an intended application? And I think it is the latter. That's the nature of a story. The story is written by the author to convey a point, or maybe a couple points. And it is not always intended to be broken down into small pieces where every piece is some doctrinal truth that he intends to communicate. And so we just have to keep that in mind. Now, the challenge when it comes to narratives about Christ is that, of course, Christ as the perfect man is an example for us in everything. And so certainly looking at his life and how he did things and what he said and how he approached things, certainly that's instructive. But we have to remember, first consider what was the author wanting to communicate? What was his point? That's where we have to start. You must understand the point of the story, because that is where the author's timeless truth or theological principle is to be found. And then you can consider, especially when it comes to Christ, there may be some examples from his life within the story that can be instructive for other kinds of applications. But we always must be careful to make sure that as we're teaching the story, that we teach the story. And be careful not to emphasize something that the author was not emphasizing, as the point of the story. I don't know if I'm making sense. We talked more about this last time, but it isn't to say that we cannot learn from Jesus's example within the narratives of the gospel. Certainly we can, and should. Hebrews 12:2 says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. So looking at how he lived life, how he showed faith, is instructive to us. At the same time, don't let his example sort of overshadow or cover what the author is trying to communicate within the particular story that you're looking at. So that's the challenge. In other stories, like if you're reading, narrative about David or, Joshua or some other person, there we have to be even more careful about using them as examples, if that's not the point of the story, because those are fallible men. With Jesus, we have an infallible man. So we can follow his example without any concern, whether it's right or not. With other humans, that aren't in the incarnate Son of God, you have to be very careful about taking their examples and using that as a principle from which to apply. So I don't know, does that distinction make sense? Do you have any questions about that? I'm kind of mixing a few principles here. So you've got the one principle, overriding principle. Narratives are descriptive, not prescriptive. So the first principle is find the author's point of the story. All right, that's the chief goal. Now, if it is a story about Christ, then there is sort of another thread through the story in terms of his example in various things that you can gain principles from. But remember, those are distinct, possibly, from the author's point. For example, in John, John, I don't think, wrote his story about the woman at the well as in order to teach the methodology to share the gospel. All right. I think his point was share the gospel with everybody. That was more his point, the Great Commission. Now, at the same time, we can look at how Jesus approached evangelism and learn from that, but that's not the point of the story. So you have to be careful to make that distinction. Now, if we're looking at another story with another human character, say in the Gospels, you know, when Jesus walked on water, and then Peter gets out and walks on the water. And I hear lots of sermons about Peter's faith there, and that the sermon is, well, is Peter the real focus? Or is Jesus the focus? So again, just being careful of using human examples from narratives to teach biblical principles or timeless truths, because unless it is clearly the point of the author that he's doing that, you just have to be careful. So anyway, I don't mean to be repetitive, but I'm just trying to capture sort of where we were last time we met. Any thoughts or questions about that, comments along these lines? Or any Brother Raleigh?
They're being demolished already, I think.
Okay. But anybody else have any comments or questions, or does a passage come to mind that you have a question about in that regard?
Sir Tim, I'd just like to make a comment. That was, I think, really knowing the context and reading the whole book and knowing what the author's situation is. Sometimes we forget that I'm not the one who will put the context into what I'm preaching. I have to put myself in the situation of the author, his real intent. Sometimes it's very dangerous, but at the same time, it's really hard work to see the context, to read the whole book, just to get the main point of maybe 1 or 2 verses in that book.
Yeah, that's good. I think there is a big danger, especially with narratives, that for the preacher to become the author. I think how you put that, reading into a passage our own context, that's a trap that we can easily fall in. And so we remove the original author, his intent, and sort of replace it with our own. And stories are easy to do that with, because there's so much you can work with in a story that they get abused extensively, I think, probably more than any other genre as far as misinterpretation. So yeah, that's important.
Pastor Tim,
Yeah, Brother Raleigh,
am I on?
can hear you.
Yeah. Uh, how do I sound? Am I coming in okay?
Yep, you're good.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Uh, I was thinking regarding the various point of view look at in terms of preaching this passage. You pointed out about evangelism, and what if I say in the point of view he was, well, as mentioned earlier, that he was focused more on seeing to it that the gospel reaches the listeners. And if I am the listener or the what do you call it, yung Samaritan woman, I can also point out the attitude with which one person, the hearers, should respond, not only keeping it to herself, but sharing it to others. And one more point of view is that if we are focused on the water, on the well, we can also talk about the living water, which is made available to the people uh, that he hopes to evangelize to. So I mean, is it possible that in all these cases, probably there are more, but in this passage alone, you can create or you can focus on various various, what should I say, various point of view with different different challenges regarding Jesus himself, who is who wants to save his people, then the to share his her newfound religion, or probably focus on the water springs of life, those things. And I mean, top of mind, I'm just saying that, is it, will I be violating a certain uh, well, will I be violating proper interpretation if I do that?
If I understand your question rightly, certainly as you go through a passage, especially when it's Jesus who's giving the instruction, he talks in this passage about living water. He talks in this passage about true worship. He talks in this passage about, with the disciples. He talks to them about the harvest. And so there's different principles, different truths that are communicated, like the living water. I mean, you can do a whole sermon on that, really. But the point is Jesus, or is John intending through the words of Jesus to teach us about living water in that passage? Or is that brought up? How is that the topic of living water that Jesus describes connected to what John's trying to communicate in the story? Now, those are two different questions, and you need to understand both if you're going to rightly preach through this account. Meaning this: when Jesus brings up the living water, you need to understand, what does he mean by that? Okay, which you can go to John 7, and Jesus describes the living water is the Holy Spirit. There are passages where Jesus says, I am the living water, and then other ones where he says, I give living water. When he says, I give living water, that's a reference to the Spirit. And so how would that connect to what John's point in the story? That's what you need to be able to answer that question. It doesn't mean we can't talk about living water and what does Jesus mean there and what does he refer to. You need to give that information in order to help people understand what he's saying, but it needs to be done in such a way that it's still guiding your hearers to understanding the story. All right. If you spent 30 minutes or the whole sermon on living water before you really, explain the whole story, I'm saying it's better to focus on the story as a whole in John's point, and then how does the living water, true worship, how do these fit into what John's trying to communicate? I think that's the priority. Now, does that mean it'd be wrong to talk about living water, do a message on that? No, certainly not. I mean, that's a biblical truth, but we want to be careful that we don't put words in John's mouth in that story. I think later in John 7, he talks about living water in detail and gives an explanation. Now there, in that story, in that passage, I think it would make more sense to go into the details there. So, and like, for example, you brought up the woman went back to the village and told the people about Christ. How does that connect to the story? Well, I think it connects very strongly to the story. We could see why John does that, because that's really the point of the story. The point Jesus is trying to get the disciples to understand, right? You need to be going out and seeking the true worshipers that the Father desires. And so certainly the woman does that. She's a foil in that sense. She's the example of what the disciples should have been doing. They should have been in the village sharing, about the Messiah, right? But they didn't. It's this woman who just came to realize who the Messiah was who goes back immediately. The disciples, it seems from the text, didn't even have that in their minds at all. And so that part fits exactly with what John's trying to get. So you're just trying to figure out through the dialogue, through the narrator, everything that's given in the story, how all of the pieces connect together. That's your objective as you're trying to understand the story. And I'm just last session and today just trying to make sure we all can understand the distinction between the point of the story, how each part fits in the story, and then how do we deal with other theological principles that we see in the story. Okay. For example, the discussion on true worship, that's very rich in doctrinal truths that certainly we would want to communicate, but we wouldn't want to communicate that as the whole point of John chapter 4. But we would want to communicate how does that connect to the point of John chapter 4. And then perhaps if you feel it's important for your hearers, you could do a series on, true worship, but that would be a separate focus that you'd want to consider. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yes, very good. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. And that's why I've talked about, at least for me, one approach I prefer is just teach the story first. And then if there are significant doctrinal truths within the story that you feel will be important for your hearers, certainly address those. And, those might be subsequent messages that you can treat more on a focused basis, like the true worship text. You can walk through that like you would in an epistle, because it's didactic, it's instructional, and you might draw other principles from scripture there that can help somebody understand better what true worship looks like. But that may not have been, what John intended to communicate as the point of his story. So you just want to be clear in making that distinction. At least that's my view. Yeah.
Yeah. Just wanted also to share because that what you're just mentioning here, uh, just right now, um, basically is a trap too when you're doing comparisons of characters. Like for example, I'm in First Samuel now, and we're in that section where the contrasts between Saul and David are becoming more and more apparent.
Yeah.
I have to be conscious um, of showing how all of that connect to the whole story and to the flow of to the flow of the story that the author wants us to see. Otherwise, I could fall into the trap of getting into um, too much character study or treatment, and I find myself having to continue to remind the congregation of how this is connected to the story, to the to the objective of the author for the whole book, and how this is connected to the bigger picture. Like sometimes when I cite some aspects of David's character in the story, when I see how this somehow points to the greater David, I have to I have to make mention of that somehow, just to see the bigger picture, just to help the people see the bigger picture. Otherwise, I can just get lost in the character studies,
Oh yeah.
and just be focused there. Yeah.
And then it's like, you know, when the part that is it chapter 9? I can't remember, where Saul's looking for the donkeys. Um,
Mm.
I think it's chapter 9. And you kind of like, what do I do with this story? Right? I mean, what? And so if we're thinking about each story as a self-contained unit that has some sort of main idea
Lesson.
or point, or, you know, we could start looking for theological principles that, you know, the author may have had no intention of communicating. So you have to keep asking, like you said, okay, how does this fit in the big picture with the, you know, with what the author's trying to accomplish? Otherwise, you know, some of the stories that you read about, you're kind of like, what do I do with this? What, I don't even know how to handle this. So do I skip it? Do I, you know, look for some particular subtle feature and just preach that, or, you know, that, or a character sketch, like you were saying, that becomes often the default, I think, in teaching narrative, especially Old Testament narrative. So yeah, it is difficult. Stories are hard to preach, because again, it's like, I mean, imagine if you're reading just some, you know, modern story, you know, you're reading, I don't know, you can pick any book, and you're reading Lord of the Rings, right? And you just take like one part of one chapter out and just focus on that. You know, you're going to miss the bigger picture, and you could come up with all kinds of interpretations about one particular series of events that if you just, and that's what, because we do that with epistles, right? We break it down into very small pieces in order to explain and give detail. That, you know, our sermons focus on just a few verses. That mentality, if we carry that over into narratives, can be detrimental to us. And yet at the same time, you're not going to do like read the whole book of 1st and 2nd Samuel and preach on that in one Sunday morning, right? I mean, that would be brutal. So that's the challenge, is, okay, if I take this big story and just look at one small piece, how do I do that and be faithful to the intent of the Spirit through the original author? That's the challenge we face. Now, if we have small narratives, like a Jonah or Ruth, something like that, where it is conceivable or possible to preach, you know, the point of the story in a message or a few messages, then it's more manageable. But to take a big narrative, which is what most narratives in the Bible are, right? Most of them are big. That's not an easy thing to do. But yeah, Robbie, I think you keep going back to, okay, how does this fit? How does this fit with the book overall? How does this fit with what the author's been focusing on here? So what is it, the story with the donkeys, you know, how does that connect to, well, he's trying to build a focus on what kind of man Saul was, and make in the big picture of the story, make the connection between Saul and Samuel. You know, this is how they met, kind of thing. Yeah. So some of the stories that you have in a big narrative are really just setups for other parts of the narrative. Like John 2, the wedding at Cana. That's not a self-contained story in itself, but it's part of the bigger narrative and setting up some other things that John wants to teach within the big story. So there requires skill on our part to be able to distinguish between those two. But David and Goliath, that's a key story connected to I believe, at least the focus of the first half, the first Samuel. Right. So sorry, I'm just going on and on here, but any other comments or thoughts, questions?
Pastor, it's more of an asking or your suggestion, because when we, like for example, for my case, when I'm making a manuscript for a sermon, I have the tendency to corroborate a particular point using some verses in the Bible. But now what you're saying is we need to be careful also in supporting a particular point using verses in the Bible. So what is your recommendation on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Gary. I think we want to be able to show people how the Bible connects, you know. So obviously we focus on a passage. There certainly is appropriate at times to draw in other passages. What I think is helpful is if you're going to draw a particular, let's say that you identify a biblical truth within a particular story, it's better to use a didactic passage like from an epistle or perhaps one of a sermon, use an instructional passage in order to teach a particular principle that may be illustrated or demonstrated in the story you're looking at. So like, for example, you know, like Pastor Robbie's going through Samuel, and there may be some noble characteristic displayed by David in a particular instance, you know, with Goliath, for example. So you can use another passage that, you know, talks about faith or something like that as a, you know, means to communicate what faith is, and then David is illustrating that within, you know, within the particular story. So it's just, there's certainly nothing wrong with it's in fact, it's helpful to draw from other passages. You just have to be careful, you know, which passage you draw from, that you understand the context of those passages, and that it does connect with what you're looking at in the story that you're preaching on. So I don't want to discourage you guys from using other parts of the Bible. I think that's an important thing to do as you're preaching the sermon, because, you know, you want people to see sort of connections with other scriptures. You just have to be careful that we don't import a different idea from another author into the passage. So
thank you, Pastor.
So like, for example, it's in John 4, if we're looking at, I think we mentioned this last week, how Jesus approached this woman in terms of evangelism methodology. And certainly we can make comment as we're preaching through the story. But if you want to talk about, how did Jesus approach, evangelism that we could learn from? Certainly what I would do is just, take a separate message and just focus not only on John 4, but I would take other passages from John's gospel, John chapter 3, John chapter 9, and the rich young ruler in Luke, and just use those as there's a variety of ways Jesus approached evangelism, and you can glean principles from his example that way, in more of a topical fashion. And that way, it's not coming across as that this is what John intended to teach on how to share, the gospel. That wasn't what John 4 was all about. I think that was something we talked about last time we met. Okay, good questions. I hope that answered or was helpful. Any others come to mind, or any other thoughts or comments? And that's what kind of prompted the follow-up discussion last week, was, Jesus's expression of a miracle in the story, and how that's an example I've seen abused, where people then take that and say, okay, this is how Jesus approached evangelism, by displaying, a miracle. So therefore, that's what we must do. And then they'll take several passages and kind of make that a principle. And again, that's an abuse of the, narratives when you do that, because you want to be able to, if Jesus said that in an instruction, as he was instructing, that's different. But he never said that was required. It's just that at times miracles did accompany the message, and particularly for the disciples and for Jesus, it was a mark that their message was authentic, because other scriptures tell us that. All right, for Jesus and the apostles, there's no scripture that tells us that is what is the norm or should be the norm for every Christian. All right, in a didactic sense, because we can look at Hebrews chapter 2, we can look at 2 Corinthians 12. Those are didactic passages that describe the miracles of Jesus and the apostles as attesting to their position, as well as authenticating their message. But that wasn't spoken of any, of all Christians, just for them. So that's where we have to, any instructional didactic passage that gives us direct instruction. But in a narrative, we have to be able to see if it's not a didactic portion of the narrative, then if it's just something that happened, then we have to be careful not to make that, the prescription or something we must do. All right. How's everybody doing on their solitaire games? Just seeing if you're paying attention. All right. Let's touch a little bit on the last sort of steps for the narrative process here. Sorry, is there a question or comment? Just arrange everything here. Okay. Let's see, maybe I'll make this a little bigger. All right, we've seen this chart multiple times now. All right, and we focused a lot of attention on the first few steps here. Let me go down to this. We focused a lot of attention, on these first steps together. After you've completed the poetic analysis, you should have a pretty good idea of the point of the story. However, there are still additional steps that are important to consider. We're not going to go through these because we've done them already, but you'll want to diagram key portions of the narrative. Don't diagram the whole narrative. It won't be helpful. But certain parts of it, especially the instructional parts, will be helpful to diagram and do textual observation on those. Significant words is always helpful. Same principle, just look for any word in the story that's either hard to understand, that seems significant in the story, that's repeated in the story, a word that may be translated differently. Again, look for those particular words that you'd want to understand. And then, of course, state the author's what, why, how, or we call the exegetical idea. And that would be what's the point of this story? And the how essentially would be the outline based upon the scenes. Again, remember, stories are structured by scenes instead of paragraphs. And so we broke down the story earlier in terms of its scenes, and that is the how portion of the exegetical idea is really each of those scenes and what the point of each of those scenes is. And then that comes from your scene analysis that we did earlier. And once you have the exegetical idea, you're now ready to turn your attention towards communicating that idea to your hearers. All right, you're moving from the exegesis side to the exposition side at this point. And just remember, the first step there is identifying the timeless truth. And that is, okay, what goes back to, okay, what's the point of this story? And what is the timeless truth behind that, or truths behind that point that applies to everybody? And this is where that discussion of like miracles in evangelism, is that the timeless truth of the story? Is that what John's trying to communicate in this account, that we are all to, if we're going to share about Jesus, there must be a miracle to accompany that so that it authenticates the message? That's where that would fall away. So, no, that's something that happened, but that's not what's being prescribed by the author. What we're trying to identify is, what's the point of the story that the author intends for us to apply to our lives? Okay, that's the timeless truth. And I won't go through all of these. I think we've discussed it before in detail, but these are, again, some of the features of that timeless truth. If you believe you've identified, okay, this is the point of the story, this is the timeless truth that supports, that is the foundation to that point. And that's where I believe in John 4, that foundation is the Great Commission. The need for Christ's disciples to be, that they need to recognize they too are sent on a mission to find true worshipers, because that's who the Father is seeking. He sent the Son in order to seek and save the lost, and the Son is commissioning the disciples in this account to do the same. And we have the woman as an example of that, even within the story itself. And so we have to ask, okay, how does that point of the story, how does that connect to our hearers today? Are we commissioned to share the gospel to the lost? Is that something we are called to do? And that would be a timeless truth. All right, as explicitly expressed in Matthew 28 and even Colossians 1, 28, 29. And here in John's story, he is demonstrating that principle first and primarily to his disciples, but that truth, that commission did not just apply to them. And that's the bridge. That's the connection point. Now, here's a good example. Who was it? Was it Gary that asked the question about other passages? And here's a good example of the timeless truth is given to us by understanding how the principle John was expressing in this passage, how it does connect to an instructional text, the Great Commission in Matthew 28, that we see the tie between those two here in the story. Questions? Comments?
Tim, just an observation that I think when you in your diagram where you're showing the flow of the process, this point of the timeless truths, there you go, in number 10. No, you can scroll down.
Oh, this one?
Yep, there, the expositional steps, the timeless truth. I think there's so much tied also to number 11, the reflection,
Yes.
which is something that I would like to maybe emphasize a bit, because sometimes the tendency is for the preacher to preach the message to the people without first applying it to himself or preaching it to himself. I've mentioned this to some pastors whenever I counsel them and tell them that many times we might not realize it. The congregation sees that. The congregation sees that you're teaching a concept, which is just a concept to you, or something that is real in your life, and that makes a big difference also in the pathos of your preaching, when it's not real or when it's real in your life, because it's something that you had meditated on, reflected on with regard to yourself. And I think it's so important, even homiletically, it impacts your homiletics. And just
In what way?
just something I wanted to share.
That's a really important point. In what way would it impact your homiletics?
I think in the way that you convey the truth, in the way that you convey the truth, do you convey it in a way that the people will see is real to you too? It's something that you had applied to yourself, so that you don't preach from a perspective of someone who's higher or better than the people you're preaching to. In that sense, that's the sense that I had that I was thinking of in terms of how it would impact the way you would preach it. So because you could just preach a concept, a biblical truth, a timeless truth, in a way that disconnects you from the audience. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, I find personally I find myself more passionate about something that has happened to me in relation to what I'm preaching, whether it is something good or whether it was a disobedience on my part. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah,
but there is a difference. I feel
you're making sense to me. I think that's a really important point. Is the conviction and the urgency, the passion, the emphasis. That is enhanced or even brought about from your own personal experience with the truth of that text. For example, you know, I think if we heard someone like one of our Pakistani brothers talk about suffering, I think we would be
Wow.
more attentive. And
Mm,
even if the message was simple,
mm,
I think there would be more of an attentiveness on our part as the hearers, as compared to maybe some, you know, rich American guy who, you know, is talking about suffering.
mm,
You know, there's a difference when one has not only experienced it, but even lived it out in such a way as to be an example. So and meditation for us is the one of the means that we allow for the Spirit to do His work in our own hearts, so that, yeah, that the passages affected us. I still, you know, was very much impacted. I think I shared this with you at some point. You know, George Whitefield led a huge revival here in the States back in the late or mid 1800s, late 1800s. And he was known for being such an eloquent preacher, but he's also known for being a passionate preacher. And he even, like unbelievers like Benjamin Franklin, one of the forefathers of the U.S. Constitution, he wasn't a believer, but he was very impacted by Whitefield's sermons, because, and he was, one of his famous quotes was, "I don't believe what he's saying, but I know he does." And he recognized Whitefield was genuine. Now it was to Benjamin Franklin's own destruction that he rejected the message of Whitefield, but even he recognized that that Whitefield was affected by the truths which he was preaching, that they weren't just, it wasn't just a eloquent speech or some, you know, lecture that he was delivering. It was a message that had impacted him as well. And he, as a result, was driven with passion and urgency that his hearers, Whitefield's hearers, would also be impacted by that message. So I think you're making a huge, this is a, you know, a very important observation or principle that we have to embrace. And yeah, you're right. This step of meditation, you know, is really where we can allow, hopefully we've been prayerful throughout the whole process, but this is really, I haven't, you know, included this step intentionally because I think it is so important that we stop and reflect on the passage, particularly as it applies to us. And if we don't do that step, we may preach an accurate sermon, but I wonder how much conviction there will be in that sermon. Is that what you're
and I
trying to
guess,
answer, Robbie?
yeah. Yes. And I guess, Tim, it's so easy to fall into the trap of being hypocritical without you even realizing it, without this step. Because you can preach in humility. Really, it's easier to preach on humility than to meditate on it and apply it to yourself.
Yeah, that's true.
Especially when you think you're humble enough, right? So
Yeah,
that's
that's
why
why.
I really believe that this part is so important, because it's so easy to just be caught up in preparing a sermon, making sure you're handling everything accurately, and then go through all of these steps and maybe skip number 11,
Yeah.
or just breeze through it, because what's important is I finish my sermon or Sunday or something like that.
Yeah, and it's especially challenging when you are preaching, you know, every week, or even preaching 1 or 2 or 3
Yeah.
messages, every week, that you just sort of become this preparation machine, where you're preparing a sermon and delivering it, but it's never passed from the eyes to the heart. It's just kind of stayed up in the head, because you got to get the sermon ready and deliver it, as opposed to considering how it is first needs to be applied to you. And that can be hard to do, especially if you're dealing with a difficult passage where you need put a lot of time into trying to understand it, especially if you're dealing with multiple teachings on a regular basis. And especially if you're dealing with a passage that you're very familiar with, where you can just rely on what you know about it and move on. Or, I guess, fourthly, dealing with a passage that hits you in an area of weakness in your own life, and so there's this guilt, or maybe if you're not seeing victory in the particular area in your own life, that you just may not give the attention needed to this step of meditation. These are some things that I found helpful for me in this process. When I get to this point, and again, this is before you're putting the sermon together. I mean, notice I intentionally put it before this step of call this really the homiletical idea, which is the sermon main point. But before getting to that step, really, we shouldn't be thinking about the sermon until we have thought about how the passage applies to ourselves. Because the real temptation is, once I know what the author's saying, boy, I jump right into getting the sermon put together, because now I'm ready. Well, no, we're not ready. If we haven't intentionally considered how does what this passage teaches first apply to me. And so here's some questions I consider when I'm trying to meditate on a passage. What does it teach me about God? How does it apply to me? How does it impact me? And those are different. Apply meaning, what can I do with it? Impact is the idea of, as I meditate upon it, what does it reveal in my own heart? Are there commands that I'm obeying or not obeying, or need to obey better? There's other things to meditate on, of course, but these are ones that I have found helpful to consider. Are there others that you guys would find helpful as you meditate on the passage? And again, by meditation, what is meant is think carefully about, reflect upon, identify the main point that it's communicating, that kind of thing. Is there any other leading questions or guiding questions you think will be helpful in this process, or ones you found helpful for you? Anybody?
This is just a comment, Tim.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's connected to directly connected to this section that you're discussing, but one of the pitfalls I believe that I, as a preacher, have to watch out against is, as I'm preaching the passage, there is this tendency to think about certain people in the congregation, right? That this might speak to, before applying it to myself. That's the tendency is always there. I'll have to be honest. And sometimes you find yourself hoping or praying, I wish, Lord, that this person would be there, which is not necessarily wrong, because what you want to do is minister to them. But if I don't check my heart, I'll completely skip through the meditation portion for myself. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, I have to, yeah, agree, confess as well with you that, and I think, sometimes, Robbie, I've had certain messages like that, where I think, oh, this guy really needs to hear it. And then it's sort of, I don't know, ironic, where that person doesn't show up that particular week, I just think, that's the Lord's way of,
No, yeah,
it's happened more than once. So I have to,
yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
and it can work the other direction too. If you don't take the time to really reflect and honestly evaluate yourself, if you just sort of ignore that, there are people that might be there that know you. So when you preach on a certain passage, if you aren't humble about it,
Right.
especially your family, right? Or your wife. And if you haven't, gone before the Lord yourself,
Right.
just honestly confess to him, and that they can see through that pretty readily. So that's also a challenge.
Yeah, you're having mentioned that. I was reminded of a pastor I knew many, many years ago, who ended up losing his ministry because whenever he would preach on the timeless truths in application, the first person who would be shaking her head was his wife.
Yeah.
Yeah, in this, and people saw that. People saw that, and it was bad. It was bad. He eventually lost his ministry. I can never forget that story.
Yeah. Uh, any other questions that you guys think would be helpful, or you found helpful as far as in meditating on a particular passage? Helpful questions to be asking ourselves as we do that. Anybody have any come to mind?
Maybe in connection with the last question, Tim,
Yeah.
are there commands that I'm not obeying or need to obey better? In what area in my life do I need repentance?
Yeah.
I would add Pastor Tim about 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 16 also. When Paul said to Timothy, keep a close watch on yourself and on your teaching. So watch close your life and your doctrine. I think that's a good fence for all pastors
Amen.
to always evaluate our teaching based on also in terms of our how we apply, how we live out those principles. Kind of humble us also if that verse is always on our mind.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a great point, really. It's a guiding principle for this section. This is also why those most gifted to preach are among the most vulnerable, because they can often just rely on their skill and giftedness to deliver a message, because they're good at it. And so they don't have to, how many examples do we have of that over the years, where guys that were really gifted preachers, are communicators and end up disqualifying themselves, but they're able to keep, didn't keep close watch on themselves, but stayed in their position in preaching because they were good at it. And that's where this meditation step again is so important, because if we just skip to, okay, I know what the author's saying, so now let me get to the sermon, because that's, he's really skilled at delivering that sermon. And if he disconnects it from himself, you do that long enough, and it's going to be some dangers. So we have to be careful. And I think in this process of meditation, it's not just that self-reflection. Meditation is often, us preaching or speaking to ourselves. We also need to be speaking to the Lord, right? And so prayer is, I incorporate this in the meditation process. It's just going before the Lord, and in light of the truths of the passage, in light of, these questions and self-reflections, we need to then go before the Lord, right? What are some things to consider as we're in this context of meditating on a particular passage? Any questions or thoughts that would be helpful as a matter of focus in prayer? Anybody have any thoughts?
Maybe we could include here, because as I was saying earlier, sometimes you can't help but think of certain people in the congregation who might benefit from a timeless truth. Maybe in this part of what you're saying here, Tim, this is a good time also to pray for those people whom the Lord brings to your mind.
Yeah. And even specifically pray the Spirit would give them understanding,
Mhm.
and give them or empower them to apply. This kind of takes us back to that diligence and dependence, that there's got to be effort on our part in seeking to understand the passage, in seeking to apply it to ourselves, in preparing the message. We have to be diligent. And then on the other side of that is the dependence, that not only does our own understanding require the Spirit to give it, but for the people to understand it, the Spirit has to do a work.
Right.
The greatest preacher on the planet will accomplish nothing of substance if the Spirit is not working, through the message.
Amen.
And I know we know that, but where this comes down to is if we haven't been praying for it, if we haven't been asking for it, then do we really believe it? And why would we expect him to bless it? I mean, he'll still use the message in the way that he so chooses, just because the word itself is powerful. But
Amen.
I mean, it's kind of like, I don't know if this is a good illustration. Doctor prescribing a medication that's really not given any thought to how to prescribe that medication. He's just told, hey, this is a vaccine for COVID. And so he just takes it and he doesn't consider anything in particular regarding how to apply it, give any attention to it or study to it, or look to others to guide him in that process. That would be kind of a reckless physician. So I don't know if that's an exact analogy here, but I think the idea of just the dependence really needs to be there if we are to be most effective in accomplishing the work, he desires. And that takes us back to, Acts chapter 8 with Philip and the Spirit wanting to use Philip to be the one to explain the text to the Ethiopian eunuch. The Holy Spirit can do that all by himself. Thank you very much. Why does he have Philip go over there explicitly to talk with the eunuch when the Spirit is the one ultimately who gives understanding? Well, it's the means that the Spirit wants to use. He wants to use his word preached and explained through people. Right? Paul said that, didn't he, in Romans 10? How will they hear without a preacher? How will they preach unless they are sent? Right? Faith comes by hearing by the word. That's just the means in which the Spirit works. So we should not be neglectful in recognizing that. And that should drive us then to be in prayer for our own understanding, but also for the understanding of our hearers. Okay, any others come to mind? Prayer.
I'd like to suggest, Tim, that prayer here is not limited to just supplicating or interceding, but also praising. Because sometimes the timeless truths just bring out something so magnificent about the Lord that you just have to stop at that point where you're preparing or working on a passage and just get into worship or praise or thanking God. And the moment that happens, what you're preparing becomes more alive, more real. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. This will also affect how would we put that? The preachers, how would you say that? Passion?
Yeah.
Anybody help me out here? Passion?
Yeah, I think that's the word. I've heard preachings on some psalms that are so clearly exalting the Lord, but without passion. Even I've heard preachings where the preacher would read the passage before he preaches on it, but lacking the passion that the psalm seems to be trying to exude.
Yeah. Yeah, I think especially, when it comes to if there's a particular attribute or characteristic of the Lord within the text, and the wonder and the amazement that we should have when coming across that particular truth. Again, that kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, Robbie, about has the passage really impacted you as the preacher? And that will come across. And so, yeah, if you're in this passage that expresses some amazing truth about God or about his work, and it's like, if that has affected you, that will come across. But that's why I often talk about, match the tone, match your tone to the tone of the passage. And I would say even to the truth that's expressed in that passage. Does your tone, expressions, passion, does it convey what what's revealed within that. And you're right, Robbie, you can tell the difference. Someone who's really been affected by particular truth.
Mhm.
And that will come across to your hearers. I mean, if you're
Yeah.
looking at, the reconciliation of God, and how
Mm.
amazing that is, that God would not only forgive, God would not only justify, but that he would seek to become a friend with. That's what reconciliation is to go from hostility to friendship. I mean, if that
Mhm.
truth doesn't blow you away,
Mhm.
and that you convey that sense of wonder and amazement as you communicate it. I've heard guys
Mhm.
talk about certain doctrines, like justification or reconciliation or adoption,
Mhm.
and they do a great job of explaining the doctrine, but it's like dispassionate. It's a lecture.
Right.
And you kind of like,
Mm.
wait a minute, didn't
Yeah.
wasn't he just talking about the fact that, of adoption, that God actually willfully and proactively pursues us as children? Like, how can you preach that and not
I'll
express
be blown away by
not
it.
yeah that's what I think. And I think this step really helps us in that, because if you just stop and clear your mind, everything that's got to get done, and just focus on the truth of the passage. Let's say you are, somewhere in Romans talking about adoption, and just as you reflect upon that particular truth, the application really might just be, how do I responding in praise and thanksgiving to the Lord? Because that's often Paul's response, right? Or John, right? In John chapter 3, or right at the end of chapter 2, behold, how did he put that? When he's talking, and it's not John, first John, when he says, behold, I'm just looking it up, how great a love the Father has, that we would be called the children of God. And even just that John expresses the emotion and amazement there by that word see, or really it's the word behold. It's an expression of emphasis. Like, this is amazing. Stop and think about this. Look at this. Behold, how great a love the Father's bestowed on us, that we would be called the children of God.
Amen.
So you can't come across truths like that and not, if you've really meditated on it, thought about it, and you're going to be affected by it. But if you're in the grind, in the mill of, I got to get this sermon, and I got to make sure I explain this and do that, and you could lose sight of really the point of the passage and the opportunity you have, because other people are going to be thinking that way too. So it's part of our job in coming alongside our hearers is to try to convey to them the depth and wonder of the particular truth of the passage, or convey to them the importance of the particular passage, or convey to them the how sober particular truth. It just depends on what the truth is. If you're talking about the wrath of God or judgment, I mean, that's going to have a different effect. But you can't talk about judgment and not have a sober tone, because you've been impacted by it as you've thought about it. Anyway, other thoughts about that, or anyone want to add to that? Or
Pastor Tim.
yeah, Manny.
Pastor, I'm just thinking about the steps, Pastor, because meditation and prayer takes place at step number 11. But is it not true, Pastor Tim, that meditation and prayer takes place all throughout the process? even in the reading, the first reading of the passage, meditation and prayer already takes place. So from the start of the process to the end of the process, meditation and prayer shouldn't really be absent.
Agreed. Now, it really does need to be at every step of the way. And I would say even at the very beginning, right? I inserted this explicitly just to make sure, you know, in the process that is not neglected, but really, yeah, it should be at every step, you know, and you know, I would put it there to make the point, but you know, when we talked about, I may not remember at the very beginning, you know, we were discussing exegesis and exposition, and that, you know, the diligence and the dependence, you know, that part, the dependence really has to be from the very beginning. And so, yeah, thank you for pointing that out. This isn't meant to just wait till step 11 to do this, but it needed to be somewhere. And so I definitely wanted to make sure to encourage everyone that if you haven't stopped and given dedicated time to this, definitely do it before you start with the sermon. But there should be this attitude and application each step of the way. So thank you for reminding us of that.
Amen.
Yeah, it's not like, okay, God, I'll take care of the study part. So and then I'll get back to you when I'm ready to preach the sermon. So you know, that's definitely not the intent of having it at step 11 here. Good. Any other
Pastor,
comments? Yeah. Yes.
maybe part of the prayer and seeking the Lord also is for how the gospel or a way to also be able to allow unbelievers perhaps, or those who haven't really committed their lives to Christ would respond to the gospel message.
Good. Thinking about your hearers, and yeah, some of them probably aren't going to be Christians. And so, yeah, that's good too. And I'm glad you brought this up, because if you are praying for them before the message, then I think you will be attentive to them during the message and making sure that you do address those who may not know the Lord, or who think they know the Lord but don't, or who might be struggling with doubt whether they do or not. So how might this particular passage be important to them? So that's good. Maybe just one other thing before we've sort of talked about this a little bit, but I want to maybe address it explicitly. And this asks this question: what can hinder us from meditating? Or I'll put it this way: from this step of meditation. And again, Manny, agree with you. This should be the tone and attitude all the way through the process. So what can even hinder us, not only from step 11, but even from this attitude or focus throughout the process? What are some hindrances or distractions?
Unrepented sin, or sin that you have not dealt with.
Yep. Maybe pride.
Yeah.
We would never say this out loud, but sometimes in our actions, I think we convey it that I am the one this sermon depends on. This sermon, people's response. Sometimes we can act like that, right? By not praying or meditating. You know, pride is a great preventer of going to the Lord or of personal reflection, right?
Sorry, it could be other ministries.
Okay. Busyness, right? Yeah, I got to get this message done. So I've had many times where I'm preparing messages and I realize, as I've spent hours or something, and I realize, have I even talked to the Lord about this at all yet? Sadly, I would say there have been many times where I just, either because there's something interesting in the passage, so I dive right in, I really want to learn it, or I'm busy, so I know I gotta get this done so I can get the sermon done because I got a counseling appointment later today, and then I'm doing a wedding this weekend, and then I've got another Bible, right? And so the focus is the output as opposed to the input. So yeah, other ministries or just busyness in general. It could be just work or family or other things too, right? That make it a challenge. Good. Anything else that comes to your mind? How about this one? Let's be honest, right? Sometimes we're just, we don't want to put in the effort. Maybe I could. Any others, guys?
Maybe you could add there lukewarmness of heart.
Yep. Maybe this kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about maybe a familiarity with a particular passage or gospel truth.
Yeah.
And so, today I watched I don't know if you guys are familiar with that series, The Chosen. I don't know if it's been on the internet. I haven't watched any of them except today. I watched, there was a special one-day showing, Christmas special at the theater. And it was just like 30 minutes, but it was kind of focused on the birth of Christ and just, him being born in the stable. And I preached on that many times, and just that he was laid in the animal trough, right? Well, in the movie, they show Joseph like clearing out the stable, and he's one of the scenes is him scooping animal poop out of the stable. And that really struck me. Like, we don't know, the Bible doesn't say Joseph was scooping dung But you know what? I've grown up raising cattle and horses, and whenever they are standing around in the stall, they poop everywhere. And it's just right. I mean, and I thought, it just struck me the humility of the Lord. And how many times, I mean, we know this story. I know this story, but certain parts of it just, can be very impactful. And I think sometimes the familiarity with something may not cause us to stop and really think about it, and so this step of meditation is so important. And so, don't let a familiarity with a particular text or truth or story or event be a hindrance to actually pondering the wonder of it. And that's just what struck me today, seeing that one little scene kind of just really hit me, that's the circumstance in which the God of the universe chose to enter humanity. It's really, really astounding.
Amen. Tim,
Yeah.
may I just add one more? And this is something that's real to me. Sometimes it's not just familiarity with the passage, but familiarity with the work itself. We have to fight against a sense of monotony, and many times I find myself advising that to pastors also and other preachers, especially new ones when they come into the ministry. And it's very pastoral ministry, especially when you're pastoring a church, can be very routine. And really, when you look at your time, it's basically you do the same thing week in, week out, unless there are some special activities otherwise. And when it can get monotonous to that in that sense that I have to prepare a message again. I have to prepare, and you have to guard against that sense of monotony. You're just so familiar with the task, and that's why every now and then I believe it's so important for us to take a short break, maybe a few days or even a week.
Yeah, that's a good
and really
point.
you have to you really have to fight against the monotony or the routineness of ministry, and that could be a hindrance to the meditation.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's kind of the maybe the duties, the obligation, especially over time. You're right. Where it can almost feel like a job, and that's a dangerous place.
Exactly.
So yeah, if you get to that point, that's a good time to just say, hey, I need to not have responsibilities this week, so I can sort of reset my heart on. And I think a lot of people in the congregation don't understand that. Even other leaders sometimes don't appreciate that they're thinking, when you want to say, I want to have time to just kind of invest in my own soul, that they don't, they're expecting output from you, whether that's counseling, whether that's sermons or Bible study, whether that's, leading in some other capacity within the church. And, but it's also important that there's a growth within our own hearts and souls and time spent working on our own hearts, that's important. So, I don't know if it was this group of guys. No, I think it was another group asking me about sabbaticals, what I think about sabbaticals. I think because the guy probably was wanting one, so he wanted some ammunition for his elders. But just I think there's a place for things like that, So. Oh, well, it's noontime already. Thanks, guys. Appreciate. I hope that was helpful. I really think it's important. Thanks for giving attention to it, Robbie. That step of meditation really is an often neglected, but one of the more important steps within the process. And even as Manny pointed out, all the way through the process. But even if you do that, where if you're praying and meditating throughout the process, it's still good to have one part where you just spend a concentrated amount of time before writing the sermon to just dedicate to it as well. So. All right. Any final thoughts before we say goodbye for today? Okay, good. Well, hopefully next week we'll just finish up on talking about preaching in there, preparing a sermon and preaching a narrative sermon. Just review some important principles there, and then we'll take a break for 6 weeks or so, and revitalize, rejuvenate for diving into prophetic genre and eschatology and some of those things. I think that'll be fun. Atong, do you be willing to close our time in prayer today?
Yes, Pastor.
All right, thank